everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We're from New Cognitive, and we're here to talk to you a little bit about, or at least introduce the concept of solutions thinking for product managers. It's really about taking a holistic approach to developing solutions to customer problems. I am your host, along with Eric Simmons. My name is Dan Walsh. You can find us on Twitter or on newcognitive.com. Eric Simmons is going to be my co-presenter today, and Ray Arell is also online. He'll be monitoring some of the chat. So our consultancy, New Cognitive, is a fairly new consultancy. This particular material on solutions thinking has been something we've been working on for a number of years. We've probably delivered versions of it maybe 50, 60 times inside of a large Fortune 100 company. And we're really excited to share it with you today. This is really the first time we've had an opportunity to present it in a webinar format. Usually it's a full-day course, 8 hours with lots of different exercises and kind of hands-on activities. So today's format is going to be primarily lecture-based. We could probably answer some questions about some of the activities. And if you're interested, we'll certainly provide more information for actually participating in a full-day session here in Portland, Oregon. We're certainly happy to present versions of this inside of companies with intact teams. That's really actually where you get most of the value. So if you have questions about following up with us on that, I will post some links and more information in the chat window by the time the webinar is over with regards to where to go for more information. So a little bit about the title, Solutions Thinking. So it's kind of a riff on design thinking, if you're familiar with that phrase, human-centered design. And that's certainly an important and pervasive approach. Some of the things we've seen occasionally is when you don't take a balanced approach, a holistic approach, sometimes, some of the things you want to do to develop, kind of compelling solutions to customer problems, you might encounter things that are less feasible or are less viable from a business perspective. And so what we advocate is kind of taking a holistic approach around solutions as opposed to just kind of a human-centered approach. And so this is a little bit about what we'll talk about today. It's a brief introduction to solutions, solutions as systems, their characteristics, and describe some of their structures. The elements in gray, we actually will not have time to go into depths. I'll probably talk for 30 to 60 seconds about the Cynefin framework, which is a situational based approach towards problem solving. And then we'll spend a bulk of the time talking about the three-circle model, which is kind of the heart of solutions thinking. It's also that diagram that you saw on the first page. We'll explore that taxonomy in more depth in this webinar today. And then lastly, we will probably just speak to some of the other frameworks that are in the class, some of the other useful models that we've kind of curated over the years that are particularly helpful for discovering solution requirements. And we'll probably address that in the last maybe 5 minutes of the class. And as we go through here, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. At the end of the webinar, maybe the last 5 to 10 minutes, we'll look at the chat and see what the questions were and see if we can't pick any of them up before we close. So onward into the first section. So what is a system? So a big part of what solutions are about is taking kind of the system level approach towards solution development. A big part of this class is also forming a taxonomy and a vocabulary of words and terms that can be used across a company. One of the big problems that large companies have oftentimes is that many different groups and divisions may use the same word to describe different concepts or different problems. And so what we advocate for is having kind of a common lexicon of terms that can be used across the company to kind of prevent some of this crosstalk and some of the communication problems that you see in large companies. And so anytime you go through this deck and you see words in yellow. This is kind of an inline definition for a particular term that we think is important. And same thing with the words in bold or italics. These are kind of reserved and special use to help make sure that teams are using these terms consistently across the organization. So when we think about solutions to customer problems, we really are talking about systems. And this is just a high-level definition of what is a system. It's a set of interdependent components, so components that are linked through various relationships that form a cohesive system. Often the system has some sort of boundary and lives within a larger ecosystem. And certainly users can be parts of the system as well, much like a horse and a rider, for example. So what is a solution? Well, a solution is an integrated set of products and services that solves a customer problem. Almost all solutions include both some component of products and services. They certainly are related to this concept of satisficing, which means you want to kind of achieve the minimum requirements to satisfy a user's goal, rather than seeking, optimality. There's no such thing as a best and optimal, solution. Often is the case. Oftentimes, you're just trying to find a solution that works and that's kind of good enough for today. In this course, we'll be talking about, various kind of ingredients to the products and services. You can think of ingredients as maybe a more specialized term for components. So what are the parts, the Lego blocks, the components of your solution, products, and services? And so we'll be talking about ingredients. The three of us actually came from a large Fortune 100 company that was really known to be kind of an ingredient provider, ingredient technology provider in the industry. And so having kind of an ingredient focus towards what your company is making can be very helpful, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. But in general, solutions are kind of purpose-built systems that solve customer problems. So a lot of people also can view their product or service, whatever you're working on, not only as an ingredient but also as a platform. And a platform is really just a kind of standard set of specification of a service that allows customers or other providers to add incremental layers of value on top of that service without special agreement. I think everyone's familiar with many platforms in the world. Things like filling up your gas tank is a platform, or railroad gauges is a platform, or the 110 volt electrical system here in the United States is a platform. If you're making some device that plugs into the wall, you don't have to sit down and negotiate with the power company about what that interface is going to look like. That is a very well-defined, interface with 2 or 3 prongs at a certain voltage with a certain frequency that you can kind of, count on across the United States. So that's a good example of a platform. And so platforms are particularly powerful because they tend to reduce the cost and effort to create solutions on top of them, and really help other kind of companies collaborate with your product in the ecosystem to add additional layers of value. And what we're advocating here is kind of using ingredients and platforms and a solution as kind of different lenses or different perspectives to focus on your product or service. So for example, if you view your product or service that you're developing as an ingredient, you would be predominantly concerned about kind of what's its function, what are the properties, how does it conform to the specification that you're promising to a potential customer. So all of those are going to be important if you view your product or service as a collection of ingredients. If you view your product or service as a platform, you will be more concerned about things like interoperability. What are the interfaces and the standards that we need to deliver consistently to allow others to kind of build on top of our platform. And you get these kind of synergistic network effects that have to do with how pervasive is a platform oftentimes the more pervasive the platform is, the more synergy, the more value that is available. And then the last lens or perspective is kind of the solution perspective. And here we're really focused on, kind of the user experience. What's the overall utility of the solution to the end customer? How well is it designed for the task at hand or the job to be done? Rather than focused on, things like functions and interoperability, we're often concerned about things like, capabilities. The ability of the system to perform some function in pursuit of an end user goal, written kind of from the user's perspective. So these are all these three lenses are all useful ways of looking at and assessing your particular product or service. Now, of course, solutions are designed to solve problems. Problems these days can be fairly complex, especially anytime a human's involved. Most situations kind of exist within this complex socio-technical setting, and as we know, complex systems that tend to be long-lived are constantly evolving. So you may have a solution that's good enough for today, but things change, the state, the art evolves, the user's expectation evolves, and what worked yesterday may not work so well in the future. So I think it's just important to kind of note that most socio-technical problems that companies are addressing today are complex, and they are often very poorly understood kind of in advance, and it's only really kind of after you solve those problems that you can better understand exactly how that problem worked and how your solution solved that problem. Most of the benefits of our solutions today, because they're going into these complex situations, most of the value kind of comes from their emergent and cross-cutting behaviors. These emergent properties are often hard to predict based on kind of an ingredient level or component level analysis of the solution, because these cross-cutting behaviors involve so many different aspects of your product that it's, including the user perhaps, that it's actually kind of hard to predict in advance what some of the properties and some of the benefits of your solutions are going to be. So, for example, some examples of these cross-cutting concerns, are the battery life of your PC. So you could take apart a PC and calculate the power drain of the monitor, of the microprocessor, the various components. You could calculate the power, the amp hours of the battery, and come up with some calculation for how long the battery life is going to last. But as soon as you kind of throw in a human into the mix, right, and what's this person doing on the laptop? Are they watching movies? Are they compressing an audio file? Are they surfing the internet? Anytime you have that kind of complex human interaction, your kind of calculations go out the window. So battery life is really kind of an emergent property of your PC and not just a simple kind of addition of component parts. And same thing with antivirus software. We could look at the list of applications running on my laptop right now and point to the antivirus software running in the stack behind the screen. But where does security live? Well, security, again, is another one of these cross-cutting emergent properties that entails a user. Am I clicking on nefarious websites or clickbait or things like that? That's certainly a big component of security. Another thing that's challenging teams is this idea of the rise of complexity. Things are becoming more and more complex. Certainly, one of these forms of complexity should resonate with you, but we have problem complexity, where you have more actors, more stakeholders. We have solution complexity in the sense that our solutions involve more parts. There's products and services oftentimes for our solutions. And it's really hard to know kind of and predict in advance whether or not our solution is actually going to solve a complex problem. And then there's certainly, kind of internal complexity as well related to our design tools, our large distributed organizations working across, company silos and things like that, as well as our development process, complexity. And to make matters worse, there's quite a bit of time to market pressure, and those time constraints and resource constraints are always increasing as well. To compound this problem and the need for kind of thinking holistically about solutions, there's also this kind of idea of choice and change in the marketplace. Customers have more opportunity to shift from one platform to another, or shift from one product to another. There's lots of competitors coming and going in the marketplace, and it's becoming more and more difficult to kind of lock in a customer to your solution. So rapidly delivering value to your end users, before they can take the opportunity to move to a competing platform is certainly important. And now, if you're like our company that was kind of grew up as a ingredient provider, as an ingredient company, and then made the move to become more of a platform provider, and then finally, over several years, is now more of a solution provider. Every time you move from ingredients to platforms to solutions, that could radically change kind of the skills needed within your organization. So what it takes to be a world-class ingredient provider is going to be very, very different than what it takes to be a world-class solution provider, because, again, back to that slide and the areas of focus, if you're an ingredient provider, you tend to be focused on the performance of individual components, whereas if you're a solution provider, you're going to be more worried about the utility and the capabilities of the system to solve a complex customer problem. And so that takes us to kind of one of the first kind of taxonomies or models of solutions thinking, which is really a mind map, kind of the 5W1H mind map that you may have seen before. And so what we did here is just kind of map out some important elements that we think go into a holistic solution. So if you kind of let your eye walk around this model from what your solution is, to who is your solution designed for, to when is it going to be used, and how is it going to be used, where and why is it used. These are all kind of important questions to think about when you're developing your particular product or solution. And so you could treat this as kind of the main 6 branches with lots of leaves. So if you can answer, or at least use this as a way of brainstorming, do we really understand, who the solution is for? Have we defined, personas and user classes and done our ethnographic research or demographic research to really understand who the solution is for? Then fantastic. Maybe you've kind of nailed that upfront, UX ethnography, branch. But as you let your eye kind of wander, you will eventually find a spot where maybe your team, your product development hasn't spent, enough time on. So, for example, maybe you'll get over to this where branch, and you haven't really thought through the use conditions. So, what are the environmental conditions that this product or service is going to be, used in? Are there certain, aspects of the use conditions that would, drive design decisions that we should know about today rather than later? Maybe it's a temperature, humidity kind of environmental concern, or are they using this product or service on a train where they may not have power, or on a plane where they may not have power, or things like that. So use conditions are certainly an important aspect when it comes to where your solution is going to be used. The other thing that you should think about as you work through this particular mind map is think about the cohesiveness across these various leaves and branches. So, for example, does this idea of use conditions, fit with, the personas that you're targeting? So, for example, if someone would say, well, that persona would never experience that type of use condition, you would want to check and make sure that that alignment, or that is kind of a cohesive element between those two leaves. And you could do that, again, with personas and value proposition, or does the ecosystem fit with the the release roadmap? Does that make sense? Because some ecosystems often take a long time to adjust and to adopt new technologies. So again, this is just the first of several models in solutions thinking. But hopefully you guys can see that, and if you're able to answer all these questions about your solution, then you will, or you should have, a more kind of holistic, well-defined, well kind of researched approach in advance of developing your solution. And so the second module that we go into is really focused on the Cynefin framework. We're not going to go through this today other than to maybe just speak to it for 30 to 60 seconds. But what the Cynefin framework is, it's really a kind of a situational leadership approach to kind of understanding the context of your situation and then prescribing, how you should work or how you should manage depending on that situation. It's broken up into these 5 kind of different domains, obvious, complicated, complex, chaotic, and disordered. And basically, depending on the domain that you're in, you would take a different approach. And so if your system is often going to exhibit many characteristics of more than one domain, so there might be, parts of your system that are complex, things that entail user, things that need to be kind of discovered, iteratively and over time by kind of probing and doing tests to see how the users may react to a particular offering or to a particular feature. And then based on that feedback, if it's working well, you would do more of it. If it's not working well, then you would do less of it. So that would be kind of a complex approach to a particular complex aspect of your solution. And other parts of your solution might be obvious or complicated that can be predicted, and just a matter of kind of gathering the right experts in the room to doing some analysis and tackling the problem that way, and maybe doing some divide and conquer and whatnot. But again, the Cynefin framework is a very powerful approach to kind of thinking about not only the problem that your solution is addressing, but also how you should go about solving that problem and developing your solution. And with that, I'm going to pass you over to Eric Simmons, who is going to pick up and talk a little bit more about the 3-circle model, which is really kind of the heart of solutions thinking.
So this next section of the class, as Dan said at the top of the hour, is in many ways the heart and soul of solutions thinking. This model is seemingly simple when you look at it, but then it turns out there's a whole lot of depth here. History, we began work on this back in the early 2000s, and you may have seen similar models to this in the Stanford D School. IDEO has a version of this that's similar, and frankly those things had some influence in the early days, but this has gone a different direction. And I think you'll find this is more deeply developed and more comprehensive than any of those other models that are out there. So that's what we're getting into. The idea here at the top level is that the best solutions and platforms and products have these 3 fundamental perspectives: the business, usage, and technology perspective. And sometimes people call this the BUT model because B-U and T, and I tell them I don't care what you call it as long as you remember it. So a 3-circle model or BUT model, whichever you prefer. You see each of these perspectives has a trio at the top: marketable, profitable, and affordable for business, desirable, useful, usable for usage, etc. And those become very important as we go through and describe the model. You'll see them return a little bit later in the half hour we have left. So what we're going to do is combine these to be a Venn diagram. And as a mathematician by training, I have to say that I am often aghast at the Venn abuse that happens on the internet when people put things together but the overlaps make no sense. So I can tell you I didn't do that here. This model really does overlap, and these overlaps make a lot of sense. We'll see some of that today, but we won't have quite enough time to get into full depth. We can explore that perhaps with you after the seminar. The thesis here is that the compelling solutions are found in the center, balancing all 3 of these perspectives. Years and years ago, decades ago, Don Norman published a paper in which he talked about the 3-legged stool, and I think that's an apt metaphor for this. It's not that we want these to be absolutely equal, but if one of them is not present to some degree, then the whole thing may fall over. So as we go through this, you're going to see that we're not necessarily talking about equality, but we do need balance. So it's more than just a picture. On the right side of this slide, in small print where you're not supposed to focus on it yet, is an exploded version of the diagram. And you can see we've named all the regions, we've named many of the boundaries between regions, and we've named many of the points, and we've decorated with other things. So this is a very well-developed model. Some people don't need to go all the way to the bottom of this, and that's fine. But one thing you can keep in mind is that if you do have to go into the depth of this, if your situation, if your company requires that you get into the deep details, they will be consistent. It's not going to fall apart on you. All right, so at the bottom you see concepts and vocabulary that aid discussion and description of system design and development. So this is a way of rallying everybody to the same general notions of how we get solutions built and what they contain. All right, as I mentioned, it's balance, not equality. So even though we draw the circles as the same size because it's pleasing to the eye, it doesn't mean you spend the exact same dollars, headcount, or minutes on the three domains. What we want is a balanced, systematic approach, not something that's just arbitrarily equal or something else. So we have time today to go through the individual circles. The full presentation does individual circles, then it does the three two-circle overlaps, and then it does the unified region at the center. So in 3 large trips, we zoom into this model. Today we have time to hit the individual circles, and I'm going to do one of the two-circle overlaps, and I'm going to give you an introduction to the center region, just to give you a flavor for this, in order to help you decide whether or not seeing the entire session would be worth your time or not. So we start with the business circle as the economic viewpoint. Each of these circles is going to be a viewpoint, and it's going to have a flow associated with it. So you're going to see almost the same thing repeated 3 times, but with some Mad Libs like word substitutions because of the differences in the circles. So the business circle, the economic viewpoint, includes all the things related to the economics of the system itself, the solution, including, as you see here, economic success criteria, value networks, and business models. And also economic aspects of things that are interdisciplinary, for example, marketing and production, which aren't just economic, but the economic elements of those are in this part of the model. You see the trio return in here, for the marketable, profitable, and affordable, where we have all the sorts of data types that you might expect to see, and I'm sure you could add to this list. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive list of all the data for your system. But these are the types of things that you would expect to see in the business aspect of the solution itself. So each circle has a flow. The flow in the business circle is the flow of investment. So this is the financial view and the flow of investment. And if we start at the outside of this flow, you see that a mission is the basis of some strategy that leads to setting objectives. And these objectives are the basis of investments that yield some form of results. In turn, those results have an effect on the overall company that can end up changing its mission. Dan mentioned earlier that the company we used to be at had several big moments of change, from an ingredient supplier to a platform supplier to a solutions supplier. And on a smaller time scale, even individual teams within a company can have their own missions change between product generations and things like that. So this flow of investment isn't an A to B line, it's actually a circle, because it connects back on itself. And you can see that the flow of investment is governed by and focused on the discipline of finance, right there at the center of that flow. Now, stepping to usage, we're going to do the same thing, but a slightly different context. So rather than the economic viewpoint, usage is the conceptual viewpoint. And this includes the description of the people who are going to use the system, their conceptual model of it, and the associated usage models. So we have business models, we also have usage models. And conceptual models are important. I used to use my mother as a good example, an elderly person who is not technology savvy, and the way that she would think about the internet as a thing. And it was more like a water pipe or the electrical supply coming into her house than it was something that an engineer would understand as a collection of routers and switches and protocols and platforms. So End users can sometimes have vastly different conceptual models from the people who build the solutions, and it's important to keep those in mind, especially around user interface. And below you see the trio of terms for usage: desirable, usable, and useful, and some of the data types that you might expect to see captured within the system related to that. So they're distinct from what we saw within the business side of things. Now the flow related to usage is not investment, it is experience. So the flow of experience starts with human values at the outside there that cause needs and wants that we would use to establish goals for using a system. And maybe you want to stay connected with your smartphone or be entertained or things like that. These goals are the basis for the user experience, which results in some sort of satisfaction or dissatisfaction over there on the right side of the flow. And we look at the experience qualities, and those, like the previous flow, this is a circle because the experience qualities can influence our human values. A good example of that is from the year 2000 or so, back when Intel created the 386 microprocessor. There was a particular number assigned to each of those CPUs that was unique. And the company proposed gently to the world that this new thing called e-commerce could be improved if they were to anonymously track who was who using this number. And you can go back into the Internet Archive and read the incredible flames that were thrown at Intel for even suggesting this level of intrusive surveillance. It was anonymous. They just wanted to ensure that that unique serial number on a CPU meant it really was you spending your money without even knowing who you were. But my gosh, you can read this article in PC Magazine, and it just excoriates the company. It's amazing. Well, fast forward 15 years. I believe all of you are carrying a device that knows who you are. It probably knows your credit card numbers. It knows where you are in 3 dimensions within 15 feet, 24 by 7, and it's fine. In fact, if you came across a company or a product that didn't protect your online identity, prevent fraud, and do other things like that, you'd probably file a suit against the company in some form of corporate malpractice. So human values have changed dramatically in a very short time. From an anthropologist's perspective, 15 years is nothing. And we've completely changed our attitude toward what technology knows and doesn't know about us, privacy versus security. And I'm sure that the environment we're in is going to cause that evolution to continue at the same pace it's been so far. So, business and the flow of investment, usage and the flow of experience. Moving to technology, this is all about the implementation viewpoint, including the implementation architecture, the workloads the system has to use, and performance characteristics. Also, these other interdisciplinary aspects, you've been reading along, I'm sure, the design and production here. Design is not merely an implementation issue. There's also the conceptual thing. You saw that on the previous slide. And the trio of terms for technology at the bottom: consumable, functional, and manufacturable. Again, you can probably add more detail to these given your current situations. These are good examples of the sorts of data that you'd capture within the model under the topic of technology. The flow for the implementation viewpoint is the flow of workload across the system. At the outside, we have these base parameters for a given problem or opportunity. And depending on the nature of those parameters, engineers will adopt heuristics, these rules of thumb, that allow us to develop a solution that Dan talked about at the beginning that satisfies the opportunity or the problem at hand. Those heuristics lead us to establish targets for measuring the performance of workloads across the system. And then after we see the performance of these workloads, we look at the tolerance of the system to the expected variation in those workloads, and those tell us whether or not we had a good set of parameters and whether or not our solution is adequate. A good example of the connected flow here is that you might, for location, for the GPS, start with saying, okay, I need position and I need time. I have these satellites, so I'm going to use Newtonian kind of physics. And you'd set your targets for your position workloads, and you'd get the performance back, and you'd find out that the tolerance was just not very good at all. You had this tremendous variance because only Newton was at the party, and you'd have to go back and invite Einstein again because some relativity has to get into this picture. So sometimes you get the wrong set of parameters, and you end up with the performance that just isn't optimal. It's not good enough. So you have to go back and do it again. But workload is a very general idea. This model is designed for very general situations. You can talk about the workloads of a restaurant in terms of the number of people coming and going, the size of the menu, and the number of dishes that have to be prepared at the same time. If you've been to a banquet, you know that bringing out salmon for 175 people at the same time is not easy to do because it's either cold or overdone or both. So the particular workload of a system like a restaurant also fits within this. And this model, even though it might be slightly slanted in my interpretation of it because of my background toward the high technology side, it has been used in some educational settings, some nonprofit settings, and some others as well. So don't treat this as something narrowly focused on high technology. All right, so in summary, we have the business circle is the economic viewpoint with the flow of investment. Usage is the conceptual viewpoint with the flow of experience. And technology is the implementation viewpoint and the flow of workload across the system. Time permits only one of the two circle overlaps within the three-circle model. So we're going to look at the value football. We like to call these footballs. Value is the relation between business and usage. This is what does tie things like market share and competitive advantage and positioning together between the economic and conceptual viewpoint. I said marketing was interdisciplinary, and it is. It has an economic aspect, but it also has a conceptual aspect. If you look at solid brands like Harley-Davidson and Apple and others out there that are just the cat's meow of brands, they do so by getting you to think about their product in such a way that creates tremendous desire, and that separates you from hard-earned economic cash and things, and your reputation. Because if you ride a Harley, you're a member of that club, and it's an identity thing as well. We won't have time to talk much about capability, but you can see it relates usage and technology, and that ingredient term Dan mentioned relates technology and business. It's how you get the stuff that you make out of your technologies to earn money from a part sale perspective. Much more about those two in the full class. But let's look at value. And we zoom in here to see that it is this space between the offering and the promise that presents value. Business makes a promise to users. It says, buy this and you will be able to do this, you will be this, right? If you remember the iconic ad for the iPod from Apple that had the silhouette of the young woman with the white earbuds, that was, you are here kind of thing. So if you buy this, you will be this. Same with Harley and the other strong brands. Usage looks to business as making an offering. So they're giving me a chance to do this. And those two things meet this outside world in the brand itself, which is the focus of the market cycle. Market is carefully chosen as a word there. It's a noun and a verb. It's the activity to market things, and it's the market itself. And in both instances, you see that the market cycle unites some of the outside world with the business and the usage, the economic and conceptual aspects of your solution, focused on value and centered on brand. So back to Dan's early comments about the taxonomy and vocabulary, you see these words appearing in italics and bold. These are the way we try to get companies, teams, even entire enterprises talking the same way and thinking the same way about the solution, because we found it really accelerates and improves development of solutions to do so. Teams don't talk past each other or around each other anymore. So at the summary level, here's a sort of post-review. You can see the three fundamental aspects, the economic, conceptual, and implementation, and the trios, and the regions named. And our assertion is integrating business usage and technology combines ingredients to provide capabilities that deliver value. The language here works very well. There's stories about how a technology team couldn't get onto uh, one of the ingredients. They'd been working all this time trying to get their technology that they worked on years and believe in it's their child, right? They really love this thing, but they couldn't get it into the product on an ingredient, and they kept trying, but they kept failing, even though technology and ingredient are right next to each other. It seems like it would be a very simple thing. So when they talk to us, we would say, look, you're never just going to force your way onto the ingredient, even though they're right next to each other. Instead, and here's a good example of how this language works, this team would have to show that its technology provided capabilities in support of usage that added value to the company's business. So if you go around the model the long way, you find that the other side of ingredient is wide open, and then yes, you're in. Now that language works no matter where you start. So what teams have to do is end up in a balanced way to be able to explain their way around the entire model. And this is a great thing to go and apply with your teams. You can draw this on a whiteboard, and you can play pin the tail on the model with sticky notes, and you can look at what do we know, what do we specify, and by the time you've placed all the sticky notes up, you're probably going to find you're very rich in some area, and there's a gap, a desert almost, of no stickies in some other area. And then it'll probably be much more obvious about where the focus should be and how to improve the overall solution description and viability, the coherence of the whole thing. Teams tend to have the most trouble on whatever it is the opposite side of their strength. So a technology team is going to have the biggest problem describing the value proposition as this overlap of the economics and conceptual side of it. Technologists, that's not their strength. And likewise, a business person who's lots and lots of finance expertise is not going to be able to describe the capabilities that are this merge between the technical aspects and the conceptual aspects. So there's a lot of cross-discipline work here, but by mapping out what your team and your company is good at, you get insights on where improvement can be found. All right, the three-circle integration, I'm just going to look at the one slide here in terms of time. So I want to save as much for that slide as I can. This just says, look, that thing we saw at the beginning on Dan's first slide, yep, a solution is still a purpose-built system that solves some customer's problem, but we can now see that structure has a little more to do with the three-circle model. And it does support a system of systems approach where something that can be viewed as an ingredient within a broad system can also be seen as a system of itself and so forth. So the three-circle model can be scaled to different dial-in, dial-out levels of abstraction for a system and a solution. When it comes to who drives, it's trouble if you don't use a meet-in-the-middle approach. Because if you go inside out, there's no saying that the solution that it is this result of a bunch of ingredients actually does anything terribly useful. Could be very wasteful, could be missing things. Outside in, you can get to what we used to call flying carpet syndrome, where I know that if I had a flying carpet, I could sell a ton of them and make lots and lots of money. But there's this little problem with that solution. There are no flying carpets. So if we just go outside in, you're not necessarily going to end up with viable technologies and ingredients at the beginning of the chain. So meet in the middle is the right way to go, and the three-circle model supports that flexible, adaptable approach. So in the time we have, I wanted to leave you with this notion of solution milestones. The three-circle model isn't a life cycle per se, but it has serious implications for how we deliver solutions. One of my largest complaints about existing life cycles is that by and large, they tend to have phases that are named based on an activity. And if Agile is a thing, and it probably is for you, then when you look at sequential life cycle phases that are named after activities, you look at it and you say, all right, I don't know what to do because I'm Agile. And maybe your company life cycle starts out with exploration. You explore something, and then you have an activity phase called planning, where you're going to go off and do a bunch of planning. And then there's another big phase where you do development. Well, if those are the kinds of phases that your life cycle does, and you're an Agile person, you get into that and you say, I don't know where to start. I'm stuck. because I can't work this way. So the solution lifecycle, informed by the three-circle model, goes a different direction and says those are flawed descriptions if they are activity sequences. What we have here is a sequence of states based on what do you know about the solution that you intend to provide. So nothing tells you how, what activity to use to get between opportunity and concept or concept to candidate. What it asks you is, what do you really know about your solution? So if you want to work in a very agile way, or if you want to use lean startup, or if you want to use a more traditional sequential approach, you can. So this model even works in hybrid organizations where you have a mix of life cycles going on, as long as you can define the right synchronization points. And we talk a lot more about that in the class, in the life cycle for solutions. So one of the best things you can do, especially if you're trying to adopt Agile, is get away from life cycles that are sequences of activities, because those just break Agile from the beginning, and get to something like this, where the real test is, what do you know about what it is you intend to provide? Much more about this in the full day. So with that, I just wanted to show you, in summary, what the overall class contains. So Dan showed you in the upper left the solution mind map that you can use, walking the leaves to say, what do I know about this? And do I understand the sort of coherence among the leaf elements as he described to you in the examples? He pointed to the Cynefin framework, a marvelous framework for improving all sorts of things within your development practices, decision-making, prioritization. We did cover some of the three-circle model and its implications to life cycle, but center of the middle row, the user experience proof points are in the other class, the full class, and the HEART framework for user experience created by a team at Google, very effective way to measure user experience and to go off and plan for what does my solution need to be in terms of these dimensions. Bottom left, the candle model and the expected, indifferent, desired, and exciting qualities of your solution and the effect that those would have on how you design and deliver it. And bottom center, those are the diffusion of innovation populations. We focus a lot on diffusion of innovations as a way to say, what is my minimum viable product and in what audience? It's a frequent problem where teams overkill their initial release because they're trying to jump to the early majority or late majority rather than serving the innovators and early adopters. You end up late to market with an overwrought, too expensive solution. And the lower right, the 5 attributes of an innovation that explain the majority of how fast and how broadly that innovation will be adopted. Relative advantage, compatibility, simplicity, trialability, and observability. So the full class covers these models, and then with practice, you can become the master of not only these models individually, but combinations of these models. And if you can achieve that, then in any kind of a setting, when you're in a conference room or some brainstorming session, you're going to be much, much more effective. The people will look at you like you're some sort of wizard if you know these models and can apply them to a situation to rapidly reason about the viability or the coherence or the details about some suggestion that's being made. All right? So with that, in the time remaining, are there any questions that we want to address online?
So Eric, one of the questions we often get asked is this three-circle model, looks impressive, but how does it actually work? How do you actually use it, with the team? And so I just wanted to maybe describe a couple of the exercises we use with teams for kind of intact sessions for how to use the three-circle model. So, for example, we've used it with teams to assess whether or not they have a balanced, set of skills across their team. So, do you have someone on your team that can account for and keep in mind the economic concerns, the implementation concerns, and the conceptual concerns for how the users can actually use the product? So if you have a team of 5, 10 people, do you have all of your bases covered in that three-circle model taxonomy? And if you don't, then that's kind of an opportunity for the team to go off and recruit additional help or maybe outsource some work. So if you don't really have a good maybe supply chain expert to help manage some ingredients or things like that, then maybe that's an opportunity for a team to kind of bone up on those skills. Another way we've used the three circle models to kind of assess your team's current knowledge gaps. So if you take all the artifacts and all the deliverables that your team is working on, you can kind of do this, we call it a pin the tail on the donkey type of exercise, where you kind of map these different artifacts and things to the three circle model, and then take a step back and say which of the regions is kind of a desert, is a void that doesn't have many artifacts or work done on it. So you will see patterns across the three circle model. So for example, if you're a team of technologists, typically engineers, maybe software developers, you might have the blue circle for technology very well covered, as well as the ingredient stack, the solution stack, or the capabilities and the interfaces and things like that. But you might have a very little done in terms of value proposition design or validation with customers. So that's a good way of kind of assessing your knowledge gaps across the three circle model. And there's a couple other exercises around checklists and product life cycles that we have done as well. But in general, that's kind of how we work with teams to use the three circle model to develop not just a balanced team, but also a holistic balanced solution. And that's it. In the chat window, we've also got a couple of links to some of the upcoming sessions. We will be posting this webinar online, so if you enjoyed it, feel free to tweet it and share it with friends. And we look forward to interacting with you via email or online. So thanks for spending some time with us this morning. Have a great day.